1919, Germany was forced to sign a treaty demanding $33 billion in reparations. Blamed for a world war, it said it did not start. By 1923, their currency collapsed so completely that a loaf of bread cost 200 billion marks. This is where the complete story of World War II truly begins, not on the battlefield, but with humiliation and economic ruin. How did these wounds ignite the chain reaction that set the world on fire? On June 28, 1919, German delegates entered the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles under armed guard. The terms waiting for them were harsh beyond precedent. Article 231, the War Guilt Clause, placed sole blame for the First World War on Germany and its allies. With that single line, the victors demanded both a confession and a punishment. The treaty required Germany to pay reparations set at 132 billion gold marks, about $33 billion at the time. This sum was so vast it would take nearly a century to repay, with the final installment not cleared until 2010. The treaty did not stop at money. Germany lost territory on every border. Alsace-Lorraine returned to France. The Polish corridor cut through Prussia, and all overseas colonies were stripped away. The army was slashed to 100,000 men. Conscription was banned. Submarines and military aircraft were outlawed. For many Germans, the treaty was not a negotiation, but a dictated peace, a diktat forced upon a nation on its knees. In the streets and newspapers, the mood turned bitter. Politicians who signed the treaty were branded as traitors and scapegoats. Veterans groups and nationalist parties seized on the humiliation, fueling a sense of betrayal that would haunt the new Weimar Republic. The reparations bill, impossible to pay in full, became a daily reminder of defeat. Every mark sent abroad, every job lost, every family struggling in the aftermath was blamed on the signatures at Versailles. The War Guilt Clause was more than a line in a treaty. It was a wound to national pride. School children learned that Germany alone had caused the war. Public monuments and textbooks echoed the verdict. For the next generation, resentment simmered beneath the surface, waiting for a leader who promised to erase the shame and restore lost honor. The seeds of anger, planted in the summer of 1919, would not stay buried for long. By 1921, Germany's first reparation payment had set off a chain reaction that no one could control. The value of the mark collapsed almost overnight. In Berlin, a loaf of bread cost 160 marks in 1922. By November 1923, that same loaf cost 200 billion marks. People carried wages home in wheelbarrows, only to find prices had doubled by the end of the day. Shops stopped marking prices altogether, posting chalkboards that changed by the hour. Middle-class families, once secure, watched their savings vanish. Retirement funds, insurance policies, even cash hidden under mattresses, all became worthless scraps of paper. In one household, a father's pension, carefully set aside for decades, could not buy a cup of coffee. Housewives rushed to market as soon as their husbands were paid, desperate to exchange marks for food before prices soared again. Children played with stacks of currency, building towers from what had been a lifetime's earnings. The crisis touched every corner of daily life. Workers demanded to be paid twice a day, knowing that waiting until evening meant their wages would buy half as much. Teachers, doctors, and civil servants, once pillars of the community, lined up for soup kitchens beside the unemployed. Renters paid with goods instead of money, a sack of potatoes for a month's shelter, a bottle of schnapps for a week's heat. In the countryside, Farmers refused to accept paper money, trading only for shoes, coal, or anything tangible. Desperation crept into the fabric of society. Bartering replaced commerce. Some families burned banknotes to keep warm through the winter. Others pawned heirlooms or sold furniture to buy bread. The old certainties of work and thrift collapsed under the weight of numbers that no one could trust. Newspapers printed stories of shopkeepers who refused to open, unable to restock their shelves fast enough to keep up with inflation. By the end of 1923, the German mark had fallen from 4.2 to 4.2 trillion per US dollar. The middle class, the backbone of the Republic, felt betrayed by a system that had promised security and delivered only chaos. For many, faith in democracy withered. In the ashes of lost savings and broken promises, voices promising order and revival began to sound less like threats and more like hope. In November 1923, a young little-known figure named Adolf Hitler tried to seize power in Munich by force. The beer hall putsch failed almost immediately. Police opened fire. Hitler was arrested and sentenced to 5 years in Landsberg prison. But prison was not defeat. Behind bars, he dictated his vision for Germany to Rudolf Hess. He wrote that the path to power would not come through street brawls or failed coups, but by working within the system itself. Germany's democracy was weak, and its economy was broken. By 1932, unemployment stood at 6 million. 1 out of every 3 workers had no job. Soup kitchens overflowed, and entire families drifted into poverty. The Weimar government seemed powerless to stop the misery. In this climate, Hitler's message found new power. He promised jobs, order, and a return to greatness. The Nazi Party's strategy shifted. Brown shirt violence faded into the background. Propaganda took center stage. Hitler's speeches were broadcast on radio, printed in newspapers, and plastered on walls. Party coffers paid for full-page ads, posters, and film reels. The Nazis understood the power of spectacle. They staged torch-lit rallies, choreographed marches, and mass gatherings. Their red and black banners became symbols of hope for some and fear for others. Elections became battlegrounds. In 1928, the Nazis were a fringe party, barely scraping 2.6% of the national vote. 4 years later, their share soared to 37%. The Great Depression had shattered faith in moderate politicians. Hitler's promises of bread and work, paired with scapegoats and simple answers, drew millions. Nazi membership ballooned, with party offices opening in every city and town. But votes alone would not hand over the state. In January 1933, a desperate coalition of conservatives and nationalists persuaded President Hindenburg to appoint Hitler as chancellor. They believed they could control him. Within weeks, the Reichstag building burned. Hitler blamed his enemies and demanded emergency powers. On March 23, 1933, the Reichstag passed the Enabling Act. With a single vote, Hitler could now make laws without parliament. The last restraints on his authority vanished. Overnight, Germany's fragile democracy was replaced by dictatorship. Political parties were banned. Opponents vanished into prisons or fled the country. The press, radio, and film fell under Nazi control. Civil servants swore loyalty not to the Constitution, but to Hitler himself. The path from failed putschist to absolute ruler had taken a decade. It was paved by economic collapse, clever propaganda, and the calculated use of fear. Now, with the machinery of state in his hands, Hitler prepared to turn radical ideas into national policy. Adolf Hitler's vision for Germany rested on a rigid racial hierarchy. one that would justify conquest, brutality, and mass murder. At its core was the myth of Judeo-Bolshevism, a conspiracy theory claiming that Jews had orchestrated both capitalism and communism, and that they were responsible for Germany's defeat, the chaos of the Weimar years, and the rise of the Soviet Union. Nazi propaganda painted Jews not just as scapegoats for Germany's troubles, but as a parasitic force undermining all of Europe. Posters, films, and textbooks hammered the message home. Jews were portrayed as the secret puppeteers behind revolutions and financial collapse, as well as the supposed architects of a global plot to destroy the Aryan race. This doctrine was not limited to anti-Semitism. Slavs, too, were cast as subhuman, Untermenschen, fit only for servitude or removal. Nazi ideology held that Germans, as Aryans, were destined to rule over these peoples. The concept of Lebensraum, translated as living space, became a central pillar of policy. Hitler argued that Germany's survival depended on expanding eastward, seizing land from Poland, Ukraine, and Russia. He called this eastern territory the future breadbasket of the Reich. In his speeches and in the pages of Mein Kampf, he described a vision of German farmers settling vast new lands, with native populations either pushed aside or exploited for labor. The regime's racial worldview was hammered into the German public from childhood. School books declared that racial purity was the foundation of national strength. Children learned to measure skulls and classify classmates by hair and eye color. The Hitler Youth and League of German Girls drilled these lessons through marches, chants, and loyalty oaths. Scientists and doctors lent their authority to these ideas, publishing charts and studies that claimed to prove Aryan superiority. The state staged exhibitions and lectures to warn of the supposed dangers of racial mixing. These beliefs were not abstract. They shaped every law and policy. In 1935, the Nuremberg Laws stripped Jews of citizenship and banned marriage between Jews and non-Jews. Newspapers published lists of undesirable names. Businesses posted signs barring Jews from entry. As the decade wore on, violence escalated from boycotts and vandalism to mass arrests and forced expulsions. The Nazi government encouraged neighbors to inform on each other, deepening fear and isolation for targeted groups. The obsession with racial purity also guided foreign policy. Hitler's generals drew up plans for invasion and colonization, convinced that war in the East was both necessary and inevitable. The military began training for campaigns aimed at erasing borders and remaking the population map of Europe. Nazi leaders spoke openly of a coming struggle against Judeo-Bolshevism, framing the Soviet Union not just as a political enemy, but as a racial threat that had to be destroyed for Germany to thrive. By the late 1930s, these ideas had moved from the fringes to the center of power. They justified the drive for territory, the targeting of entire populations, and the machinery of state violence that would soon sweep across the continent. Hitler's racial doctrine was not just an excuse for war. It was the engine behind a campaign of expansion and annihilation that would define the next chapter of Europe's history. By 1935, the promises and restrictions of Versailles were unraveling at a breathtaking pace. In open defiance of the treaty, Germany announced the existence of the Luftwaffe. For the first time since the war, German bombers and fighters roared across the sky, a direct challenge to the post-war order. The world learned that Hitler's Air Force was not a rumor, but a reality. One that had been built in secret, and now revealed with pride. The shock rippled through European capitals. That same year, Hitler reintroduced conscription, swelling the German army far beyond the 100,000-man limit set in 1919. The message was clear: Germany would no longer accept the role of a defeated power. Yet, as Germany cast off its shackles, the Allies could not agree on how to respond. In London, British leaders signed the Anglo-German Naval Agreement, allowing Germany to build a fleet up to 35% the size of the Royal Navy. The hope was to manage German ambitions through compromise, but the effect was to legitimize rearmament and undermine the treaty's authority. French leaders, haunted by memories of invasion, chose a different path. They poured resources into the Maginot Line, a vast concrete barrier stretching 450 kilometers along the German border. Pillboxes, gun emplacements, and underground bunkers promised security through engineering. The Maginot Line became a symbol of French resolve, but also of a defensive mindset shaped by the trauma of the last war. French generals trusted that this wall would hold, even as the world around them changed. Behind closed doors, British and French officials debated the best course. Some urged confrontation, warning that every concession made Germany bolder. Others, still reeling from the losses of World War I, argued for caution and negotiation. Intelligence reports underestimated the speed and scale of German rearmament. British analysts believed the Luftwaffe was still years away from matching their own strength, unaware that German factories were working around the clock. While the Allies hesitated, Germany's military machine grew stronger every month. New tanks rolled off assembly lines, pilots trained for war under the cover of civilian flying clubs. The old order of Versailles was crumbling, replaced by a race to prepare for the next conflict. In the space between hope and fear, Europe's leaders faced the reality that deterrence had slipped from their grasp. In March 1938, German troops crossed the border into Austria. The move was swift and carefully orchestrated. Austrian Chancellor Kurt Schuschnigg, pressured by threats and mounting Nazi agitation, agreed to install pro-German ministers. Plans for a national referendum on independence were scrapped as Hitler demanded immediate union. On March 12, 1938, German soldiers entered Vienna without resistance. Crowds lined the streets, some cheering, others silent. The Austrian parliament was dissolved. Within days, Austria was absorbed into the German Reich, its sovereignty erased. The world watched, but no one intervened. Within months, Hitler set his sights on Czechoslovakia's Sudetenland, home to 3 million ethnic Germans. He claimed they faced discrimination and demanded self-determination. Nazi propaganda fueled tensions, staging reports of violence against Germans. The Czech government, alarmed but isolated, mobilized its army. Britain and France, haunted by the memory of the last war, pressed for negotiation. British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain flew to Germany 3 times in September 1938, desperate to avoid conflict. The result was the Munich Agreement, signed on September 30, 1938. Without Czechoslovakia's input, Britain and France handed over the Sudetenland in exchange for Hitler's promise of peace. Chamberlain returned to London, waving the agreement and declaring, "I believe it is peace for our time." In Prague, the cost was clear. The country lost its natural defenses and vital industries overnight. German troops marched into the Sudetenland as Czech soldiers withdrew. The world's relief was short-lived. In March 1939, Hitler broke his word. On March 15, 1939, under cover of night, he summoned Czech President Emil Hácha to Berlin. After hours of threats, Hácha collapsed and signed away his country's fate. German forces entered Prague on March 15, 1939. The Czech lands fell under German control, while Slovakia became a Nazi puppet state. Each concession emboldened Hitler. The pattern was unmistakable. Demands followed by threats and then force. Promises made in Munich were exposed as empty. The hope that giving up territory could secure peace vanished. Europe stood on the brink, with the lesson that appeasement had only bought time. On the night of August 23, 1939, diplomats gathered in Moscow for a meeting that would stun the world. German Foreign Minister Joachim von Ribbentrop and Soviet Commissar Vyacheslav Molotov signed a pact of non-aggression, with Joseph Stalin himself present to endorse the deal. The official document promised peace between two bitter enemies. Behind closed doors, secret protocols carved up Eastern Europe in advance. Poland, the Baltic states, even Finland, all divided on a map before a single shot was fired. Within days, the plan moved from paper to reality. At dawn on September 1, 1939, 1.5 million German troops surged across Poland's western border. Tanks rolled through villages, while the Luftwaffe bombed railways and cities. The speed and violence of the attack caught the world off guard. Polish defenses, outnumbered and outgunned, struggled to hold the line. In Warsaw, citizens took cover as bombs fell, the sky filled with smoke and the roar of engines. Britain and France responded with declarations of war on September 3, 1939. Yet, for months, their armies remained behind the Maginot Line, exchanging only leaflets and patrols with German forces. Newspapers called it the phony war, a conflict declared but not fought, while Poland was left to face the onslaught alone. On September 17th, the Red Army crossed Poland's eastern border. Soviet units advanced rapidly, claiming their share of territory as agreed in the secret protocol. Polish troops, already battered by German attacks, now found themselves surrounded on two fronts. The government fled into exile, and by early October, Poland was partitioned. The western half fell under German rule. The east was absorbed by the Soviet Union. For Stalin, the pact was a calculated move. By joining Hitler in dividing Poland, the Soviet leader bought time to build up his own military strength and pushed his border hundreds of kilometers west. German and Soviet officers met on the ground, shaking hands over conquered territory. The world watched in disbelief as two sworn ideological enemies became partners in aggression. The uneasy pause that followed, the lull of the phony war, would not last. Across Europe, people waited, uncertain who would be the next target. Soviet troops massed along the Finnish border in late November 1939, demanding territory to protect Leningrad, which lay just 50 kilometers from the frontier. When Finland refused, artillery opened fire. The Winter War began with Soviet tanks and planes overwhelming the frozen forests. But Finnish ski troops, outnumbered and outgunned, struck back with speed and cunning. In temperatures plunging to -40, the Finns destroyed entire Soviet columns, inflicting 5 times as many casualties as they suffered. Yet the cost was staggering. After 2 months of relentless assault, Finland agreed to cede 11% of its territory in March 1940. The battered nation survived, but at a heavy price. As the snow melted in the north, the war's front lines shifted again. On April 9, 1940, German forces launched simultaneous invasions of Denmark and Norway. Denmark surrendered within hours. In Norway, paratroopers seized airfields and ports before dawn, while warships landed troops along the coast. The Norwegian government fled into exile, and within weeks, a Nazi-backed regime controlled Oslo. The Scandinavian campaign gave Hitler control of vital shipping lanes and iron ore supplies, but sent shockwaves through Britain's political establishment. In London, frustration boiled over. The failed defense of Norway exposed deep divisions in Parliament. On May 10, 1940, Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain resigned after a stormy debate. Winston Churchill, already known for his warnings about German aggression, was asked to form a new government. Churchill's arrival signaled a new resolve. He spoke of fighting on the beaches and never surrendering, rallying a nation bracing for the next blow. As the world watched, the war's center of gravity shifted west, and a new chapter began under Churchill's command. Before dawn on May 10, 1940, the German war machine unleashed its full might on Western Europe. 3 million soldiers surged forward, backed by more than 1,000 bombers. While Army Group B drew Allied forces into Belgium and the Netherlands, and Army Group C pressed against the Maginot Line, the real blow landed where few expected, through the dense Ardennes forest. French commanders had dismissed this region as impassable for tanks. Yet, over 40,000 vehicles, including hundreds of panzers, snaked through narrow, winding roads, engines roaring day and night. The secret behind this relentless advance was not only tactical surprise. Wehrmacht medical officers distributed millions of Pervitin tablets, an early form of methamphetamine. Orders allowed tank crews, truck drivers, and infantry to march and fight without sleep for days at a time. Frontline diaries describe men pushing on for 48 hours, eyes wide, nerves raw, hunger and exhaustion numbed by the drug's effects. The German columns moved with a speed and ferocity that stunned their enemies. By mid-May, panzers reached Sedan on the Meuse River, shattering the French defensive line in a matter of hours. Communications collapsed. British and French units found themselves surrounded, cut off from supplies and retreat. Within 2 weeks, nearly 400,000 Allied soldiers were pressed against the Channel at Dunkirk. Under constant bombardment from the Luftwaffe and advancing ground forces, the beaches became a desperate bottleneck. Operation Dynamo began on May 26th. Royal Navy destroyers, merchant ships, and an armada of civilian fishing boats braved mines and machine gun fire to reach the shore. For 9 days, chaos reigned. Lines of men waded into the surf, waiting for rescue. Royal Air Force pilots fought above, buying precious minutes for the evacuation below. By June 4th, more than 338,000 troops had escaped, leaving behind nearly all their equipment, but not their will to fight. The miracle of Dunkirk became a story of both defeat and survival, as Europe braced for whatever would come next. On June 10, 1940, Mussolini declared war on France and Britain, seeking to claim a share of the spoils as German forces swept through Western Europe. Less than 2 weeks later, France signed an armistice with Germany. The ceremony took place in a railway carriage at Compiègne, the very spot where Germany had surrendered in 1918. This time, it was the French who signed away their nation's freedom. Northern and Western France fell under direct German occupation. The rest, governed from Vichy, became a puppet regime, forced to cooperate with Nazi demands. By the end of June, Hitler's flag flew over nearly all of Western and Central Europe. Austria, Czechoslovakia, Poland, Denmark, Norway, Belgium, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, and now France, all under Axis control. Only Britain remained, battered but unbroken. As maps of the continent changed overnight, the world's attention turned to London. Winston Churchill, now Prime Minister, addressed the House of Commons with words that would echo through history. He said, "We shall fight on the beaches, we shall fight on the landing grounds, we shall fight in the fields, and in the streets. We shall never surrender." Those words became a rallying cry. Britain's stand was not a solitary one. Across the Empire and Commonwealth, the response was immediate. Canada mobilized troops and factories. Australia and New Zealand sent soldiers and supplies. India contributed men and resources on a massive scale. South Africa joined the fight. From every corner of the globe, volunteers and materials poured in, determined to resist Nazi domination. The defeat of France left Britain isolated on the map, but far from alone in spirit. The nation braced for invasion. Factories shifted to full war production, and the Royal Air Force prepared for the next onslaught. Hitler's armies controlled the continent from the Atlantic to the Soviet border. But the war was far from over. Britain's refusal to yield and the rallying of its global partners set the stage for a new chapter in the struggle, a contest not just for territory, but for the future of freedom itself. The forces that unleashed global war, including economic collapse, propaganda, and unchecked power, are not relics of the past. Today, more than 40 conflicts rage worldwide, and authoritarian politics are on the rise. The lesson is clear. When the warning signs are ignored, history doesn't just repeat, it escalates. The price of complacency remains as high now as it was then. What we choose to recognize, we still have the power to change. Share your thoughts below.